The unit number is 214. I want to say that first because the number is the only thing in this story that has stayed the same from beginning to end, and you should hold on to it the way I held on to it, because everything else in the building moves. My name is Devin Alls. I am 34 years old. I work the overnight shift at a self-storage facility called Key Point Self-Storage off Route 13 in Newcastle County, Delaware. And before that, I worked the line at a chain steakhouse for 11 years until my knees gave out and my marriage gave out in roughly the same 6-month window. The storage job pays less than the steakhouse did, but it lets me sleep during the day when my daughter is at her mother's place, and it lets me sit in a small, heated office between 10 at night and 6 in the morning watching 12 security monitors that mostly show nothing. I'm not a security guard. I'm a night clerk. The difference matters to the company because guards have to be licensed in Delaware and clerks do not. My job is to answer the buzzer if a tenant locks themselves out, to log after-hours access, to run the floor buffer down the main corridor once a week, and to call the regional manager if anything looks like a real problem. In 4 months on the job, I have called the regional manager exactly once about a raccoon that had gotten into the dumpster enclosure and would not leave. I am telling you all of this because I want you to understand that I am not the kind of person who goes looking for trouble. I am the kind of person who needs this job and who would lose this job immediately if I started behaving the way I have been behaving for the last 3 weeks. I am telling you this because what I am about to describe started as a paperwork problem, the way most real problems do, and because the man before me, the clerk who worked this same shift for 9 months and then stopped showing up, his name was Marco Vella, and Marco Vella opened Unit 214 on a Tuesday night in August, and Marco Vella has not been seen since. The first time I noticed anything was a Wednesday in late September. The buzzer went off at 2:14 in the morning. The number on the access pad was 214. I looked at the monitor for Corridor C, which is where Unit 214 sits, and I saw nothing. No car in the loading bay, no person at the gate. The buzzer kept going. I checked the access log on the computer, and the log said the tenant for Unit 214, a woman listed as J. Reinecke with a Wilmington billing address, had entered her code at the front gate at 211. The gate cameras for 211 showed an empty driveway. No vehicle, no pedestrian. The arm of the gate, on the video, lifted by itself and lowered by itself, in the rhythm of a car passing through. Except there was no car. I am the kind of person who writes things down. I wrote it down. I wrote, gate cycled without vehicle at 0211, buzzer 0214, Unit 214 in the access log. And I put my initials next to it, and I went back to the monitors. The buzzer stopped on its own a few minutes later. I did not get up from my chair. I want to be honest about that. I did not walk down to Corridor C and check, because Corridor C is a 4-minute walk from the office, because the heaters in the corridors are set to 55 degrees at night, because I had a cup of coffee in front of me that was still warm, and because I was, at that point, treating it as a glitch. Storage facilities are full of glitches. The gate sensor here is 20 years old. The access pad sometimes accepts codes that have been deactivated for a decade. I have a coworker, a day clerk named Brenda Sarek, who once told me that the system here has more ghosts in it than anybody admits. And she meant software ghosts. And so did I when I wrote my note. The next morning when my shift ended, I walked the building once on my way out. This is not part of the job. The day clerk is supposed to do the morning walk. I walked it anyway, because 4 months of sitting in an office had given me restless legs, and because the corridor was on my way to the parking lot. I went past Unit 214. The door was a standard rolling door, painted the same dull industrial green as every other door in Corridor C. The lock on the latch was a brass disc lock. The disc was old enough that the brass had darkened to a dull bronze color, and the keyway slot had the kind of patina that only develops on hardware that has been turned hundreds of times. None of the other units in Corridor C had brass disc locks. Every other unit had either the company-issued cylinder lock or a modern steel padlock from a hardware store. I noted the brass disc, and I noted that the corridor smelled very faintly of something I could not place. Not mildew, not rust, not the chemical sweetness of the floor cleaner, but something underneath all of those. The way a kitchen smells of yeast even after you've scrubbed every surface. The second time the buzzer went off was the following Monday. Same hour. 2:11 on the gate, 2:14 on the buzzer. Unit 214. This time I did get up. I walked down corridor A, through the cross passage, down corridor C, and I stood in front of unit 214, and the corridor was empty, and the unit door was closed and locked and undisturbed, and the brass disc lock was exactly where it had been the morning before. I stood there for maybe 90 seconds and listened, and the corridor made the noises corridors make. The hum of the fluorescents and the soft tick of the metal roof contracting, and then, very softly, from inside the unit, I heard a sound that I want to describe carefully because I have been describing it to myself for 3 weeks, and I still have not gotten it right. It was the sound of somebody setting down a heavy object on a concrete floor. Not dropping, setting, the way you would set down a cooler full of water if you didn't want to spill it. One slow contact, a slight grinding adjustment, and then silence. I waited. I waited a long time. The sound did not repeat. I walked back to the office, and on the way I noticed for the first time that the brass disc lock had something scratched into the face of it, very faintly, almost worn out. A single letter. The letter M, scratched with the point of a key, into the brass. When I got back to the office, I pulled the tenant file for 214 on the computer. The system listed J. Reinecke, paid through the end of the calendar year. No late fees, no notes. I pulled the paper file from the cabinet behind my desk, because we keep paper files for any tenant who signed before the system went digital in 2019, and the paper file for 214 was thicker than I expected. It contained 6 rental agreements, stacked in chronological order, the oldest from 1998, the most recent signed in March of this year by J. Reinecke. 6 tenants, same unit. None of them had ever moved out, in the sense that none of the agreements had a closure date stamped on them. Each one just stopped, and the next one began, like a relay handoff. I have worked here 4 months. I had never opened that file before. I had no reason to. Tenants don't usually generate paper after the initial signing. The oldest agreement, from 1998, was signed by a man named Howard Lessep. I read the whole thing in the office that night because I had time and because the paper felt strange in my hands, the kind of brittle that old contracts get when they've been kept somewhere that wasn't quite climate-controlled. Howard Lessep had listed his occupation as transport and his home address as a P.O. box in Newark, Delaware. He had rented Unit 214 for a single year, which is unusual because the standard agreement here is month to month and has been since the place opened. There was a handwritten note at the bottom of his agreement, in pencil, in a manager's handwriting I didn't recognize, that said, "Holds own lock. Do not re-cylinder under any condition. Do not enter during turnover. See binder." I want to tell you that I stopped there, that I put the file back and went home and forgot about it, but I didn't. I pulled the next agreement. 2003. A woman named Patricia Ng. Same single-year term. Same handwritten note at the bottom, in different handwriting now, but the same words. Holds own lock. Do not re-cylinder. Do not enter during turnover. See binder. I pulled the next one. 2008. A man named Dale Vorhauer. Same note. 2013. A woman named Esme Tassin. Same note. 2018. A man named Robert Quill. Same note. And then March of this year, J. Reinecke. The note at the bottom of her agreement was typed, not handwritten, but the words were identical, and the phrase "see binder" was followed by an asterisk, and the typed instruction, "binder maintained in office safe," combination known to clerk on duty. I have been in this office 4 months. I have opened the safe maybe 20 times, mostly to drop the day's cash receipts. I had never noticed a binder in the safe. I sat with the file open on my desk for a long while, and then I got up and walked to the safe and turned the dial. The safe is an old Century model bolted to the floor under the desk. Inside it, behind the cash bag and the spare gate remotes and the petty cash envelope, there was a black 3-ring binder. It was the kind of binder you buy at an office supply store for $9. It had no label on the spine. I lifted it out and set it on the desk, and I noticed before I opened it that the binder smelled faintly of the same thing the corridor outside 214 had smelled, of that yeasty undertone, like dough left out too long. The binder was about half full. The first page was a typed sheet of instructions, undated with no letterhead. It said, in numbered points, that Unit 214 was a long-term tenant arrangement, that the tenant maintained their own lock and key, that no employee of Keypoint Self-Storage was to attempt entry into Unit 214 for any reason, including inspection, fire safety, lien sale, or pest control, and that if the tenant of record requested an access escort, the clerk on duty was to remain at the office and inform the tenant that escorts were not currently available. It said that under no circumstances was a clerk to physically accompany the tenant to the unit. It said that this protocol had been in place since the original construction of the building in 1994, and that the operator at the time had transferred the protocol forward with each subsequent ownership change. It was signed at the bottom, in pen, M. Halsey, operator 1994. I had never heard of our Halsey. The current company had bought the facility in 2011. I sat with that binder open in front of me until the sun came up. I am not a clever man, and I do not claim to be, but I have been in enough kitchens to know when a system is running on something other than what it says it's running on. When a sous chef keeps a separate notebook of substitutions that the head chef never sees. When the inventory in the walk-in doesn't match the order sheet but matches the same delta every week, you learn to recognize the shape of an arrangement that's been carried by hand from one person to the next. That binder looked like an arrangement. That binder looked like the kind of thing that had been deliberately preserved across 3 different corporate owners by somebody making sure it always got handed forward. When Brenda came in at 6, I asked her about Marco. I had been told, when I was hired, that the previous night clerk had quit without notice. That was the phrase in the hiring email. Quit without notice. Brenda had worked with Marco for the full 9 months he was here. She poured herself coffee, the way she does, and she sat down on the corner of my desk, and she said, Marco didn't quit. Marco stopped coming in. There's a difference. I asked her what the difference was. She said, when somebody quits, you find their stuff missing from the office. When somebody stops coming in, you find their jacket still on the hook. She nodded at the coat rack by the office door. There was a jacket on it, a black canvas Carhartt, size large, with a Sherpa collar. I had been hanging my own jacket next to it for 4 months without thinking about it. I had assumed it belonged to the company. I asked her if anybody had filed a missing persons report. She said the regional manager called Marco's emergency contact, which was a sister in Baltimore, and the sister said Marco hadn't been in touch with her for 2 years before the job started, so she wasn't going to file anything. The regional manager waited the 2 weeks the company requires, marked him as voluntarily terminated, and posted my job listing. Brenda said she had asked at the time whether the security footage from Marco's last shift had been pulled. She said it had not. She said the footage from that shift had been overwritten in the normal 7-day cycle before anybody thought to look. I asked her if she knew which unit Marco had last accessed. She looked at me for a long moment over the rim of her coffee cup. She said, "Why are you asking me that question, Devin?" I told her about the buzzer, the gate, the paper file, the binder in the safe. She listened the whole way through without interrupting, which is not how Brenda usually listens to anything. When I was done, she set her coffee down on my desk and she said, "Marco opened 214 on the night he stopped coming in. He told me about it the morning before. He said the tenant had called the office requesting an access escort. He said he didn't like the sound of her voice on the phone. He said the binder told him not to go, but he went anyway because the tenant said she was elderly and afraid of the dark." That's the last conversation I had with him. She picked her coffee back up. She said, "I should have told somebody. I didn't know who to tell and I didn't want to be the one who sounded crazy." I went home that morning and I slept for 4 hours, and I woke up at noon thinking about the brass disc lock with the letter M scratched into it. And I thought about Marco Vela, whose name starts with M, and I thought about Howard Lessepp and Patricia Ing and Dale Vorhauer and Esme Tassin and Robert Quill and M. Halsey, and I thought about how many people had touched that lock with the point of a key over 30 years, and whether the M had been scratched by Marco or whether the M had been there before Marco and Marco had only matched it. I thought about that for a long time. Then I made my daughter dinner. It was my Thursday with her, and she wanted spaghetti with butter and Parmesan, the way her mother makes it. And I didn't think about it again until I clocked in at 10 that night and saw, on the access log, that someone had entered Jay Reineke's code at the front gate at 9:58, 3 minutes before my shift started, and that the gate cameras for 9:58 showed an empty driveway, and that the buzzer for Unit 214 was, at that exact moment, going off in the empty office, and had apparently been going off, according to the system clock, for the entire 2 minutes it took me to walk from my car to the door. I let the buzzer ring. I want to say that calmly, but I was not calm. I stood inside the office door with my hand on the light switch, and I let it ring, and I counted the rings, the way you count contractions when somebody is in labor, because counting is what you do when you cannot do anything else. The buzzer rang 11 more times after I came in. Then it stopped. The clock on the wall said 10:03. I locked the office door behind me, which is not policy, and I sat down at the desk. The first thing I did was pull the call log on the office phone. The binder had said the tenant of record sometimes called the office to request an access escort. And Brenda had said that was what happened the night Marco went down the corridor. I wanted to know if Jay Reineke had ever called the office on a night I was working. The call log on the office phone only goes back 30 days. There were 2 calls from a 302 number I did not recognize. One at 11:40 on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago, and one at 11:42 on a Tuesday 2 weeks ago. Both calls had been answered. Both calls had lasted under 30 seconds. And both calls had been answered by me. I had no memory of either call. I do not pick up the phone when it rings between 11 and midnight, because that is when I'm usually walking the front lot, and the phone goes to a voicemail box that I clear in the morning. The log said I had answered. I had not answered. I wrote the 302 number on a sticky note, and I put the sticky note in my wallet, and I did not call it from the office phone. I am not a clever man, as I said. But I have read enough about how phone numbers work to know that calling a number from a known line creates a record on both ends, and I did not want the tenant of record to have a record of my line calling hers, because I was beginning to suspect that the tenant of record was not a person in any sense that I understood the word. The second thing I did was go back into the safe and read the rest of the binder. The first page had been the protocol sheet. The pages behind it were a kind of incident log. Not every clerk had written in it, and the entries were sparse, sometimes years apart. But the format was consistent. Date, clerk initials, description, outcome. The earliest entry was from 1996 and described a corridor pest inspection during which the inspector had attempted to enter 214 with a master key. The entry said the inspector had been redirected to the office, signed a non-disclosure form that was kept in a separate file I could not find, and had been paid an additional $80 for the inconvenience. The outcome line said, compliance secured. There were 11 entries in total over 28 years. 3 of them concerned attempted entries by employees of the facility. 2 of those 3 were marked with the same outcome. Employee separated, replacement onboarded, CHR. The third, the most recent, was dated August 14th of this year. The clerk initials were MV. The description was a single line. Tenant requested escort 2341. Clerk departed office 2343. Clerk did not return. The outcome line was blank. I sat with that line for a while. Marco Vela had written every entry in the binder up to the night he stopped coming in. The handwriting was the same, careful and slightly slanted all the way through. The blank outcome line on August 14th had not been filled in by anyone, which meant either that no clerk after Marco had read the binder, or that no clerk after Marco had felt able to summarize what had happened. I am the clerk after Marco. I am also, apparently, the first clerk in 28 years to read the binder more than once. There was no entry for either of the recent 214 buzzer events. I had not written them in. The binder had not written itself. The third thing I did was something I should not have done. I went into the back office, where the regional manager keeps a locked filing cabinet for personnel records, and I picked the lock with a paperclip and a butter knife from the break room. I want you to understand that I have never done anything like that in my life. I have never stolen from a register, never lied on a time card, never even taken home a bag of bread rolls from the steakhouse pass on a night when they were going to throw them out. I picked the lock because Marco Vela's personnel file was in that cabinet, and because nobody else was going to look for him, and because the woman in Baltimore who had stopped speaking to him 2 years ago was not going to file a report, and because I had been hanging my coat next to his coat for 4 months, and that felt, suddenly, like a debt. The file was thin. Marco Vela, hired January of last year, Delaware driver's license, social security number, direct deposit routing, emergency contact in Baltimore, no previous employment listed. A single performance review at the 6-month mark, marked satisfactory, signed by the regional manager. A note clipped to the back, in the regional manager's handwriting, dated August 28th of this year, which said, "Sister contacted, will not file. Mark voluntary. Post listing, do not reference 214. I read that last line 3 times. Do not reference 214. The regional manager had known. The regional manager had written it down, and then had closed the file, and then had hired me. I put the file back. I closed the cabinet. I went back to the front office and sat at the desk, and I watched the corridor C monitor for the rest of the shift. Nothing moved. The buzzer did not ring again. At 5:50 in the morning, 10 minutes before Brenda was due in, the gate camera caught a delivery truck pulling into the loading bay, a regional courier that drops parcels for the units that pay for receiving service. The driver got out, unloaded 2 boxes onto the loading dock, scanned them into our system through the side door, and drove away. I watched him do it. It was a normal morning event. I had seen the same driver do the same thing 5 mornings a week for 4 months. But when I looked at the receiving log on the computer afterwards, there were 3 boxes listed, not 2. The third box was logged to Unit 214. The package weight was 41 pounds. The shipper field was blank. The receiving signature field said DAHLS, which is my name, although I had not signed for anything. I want to be precise about what I felt when I saw my own initials on the receiving log for a box I had not signed for. It was not fear. Not yet. It was the same feeling I used to get on the line at the steakhouse when I would reach for a sauté pan and find that somebody had already moved it to the burner I was about to use. The feeling of an arrangement around you that you did not arrange. The feeling of being included in a process you had not agreed to be included in. I walked out to the loading dock. There were 2 boxes on the dock, both addressed to other units, both with proper labels and tracking numbers. There was no third box. I checked the dock, the area behind the dock, the corridor leading away from the dock toward the units. No third box. I walked down Corridor C to Unit 214. The corridor was empty. The brass disc lock was on the door, the M scratched into its face. Exactly where it had been, there was no box outside the unit. There was no box anywhere in the building that I could find. The system said one had been received and signed for in my name and routed to 214. The physical world said it had not. When Brenda came in, I did not tell her about the box. I did not tell her about the binder, or about the personnel file, or about the lockpicking. I asked her one question. I asked her if she remembered the name of the regional manager who had been in charge before the current one. She thought about it. She said the current regional manager had been brought in when the company restructured in 2019. Before that, the regional manager had been a woman named Halsey, who had worked the territory since the building changed hands in 2011, and who had retired during the restructure. I asked Brenda her first name. Brenda said she thought it was Margaret, but she wasn't sure. The signature on the protocol sheet in the binder had said, Emma Halsey, Operator, 1994. The same surname across a 30-year span, in 2 different roles, at 2 different companies that had owned the same building. I asked Brenda whether Margaret Halsey was still alive. Brenda said she had no idea. She said the going-away card had been signed by a lot of people and that Brenda had not been one of them. I left work that morning and I drove home along Route 13, and I thought about how often a surname like Halsey could occur in a small operations field over 30 years, and whether it was reasonable to assume that 2 F. Halseys were the same person, or whether it was reasonable to assume that the binder had been signed in 1994 by somebody who later passed both the binder and the territory to a relative, perhaps a daughter, perhaps a niece, who had eventually retired in 2019. Either possibility, I realized, required somebody to have made a decision, at some point, to keep the protocol going. The protocol did not perpetuate itself. Somebody, in every generation, had chosen to hand it forward. I slept 4 hours. I woke up. I made coffee. I called the 302 number from the sticky note in my wallet on a prepaid phone I bought at a 7-Eleven on the way home, because I did not want my own number to appear on the tenant's records. The phone rang once. A woman's voice answered. The voice was clear, unhurried, middle-aged, neither alarmed nor pleased to be called. The voice said, Keypoint, Unit 214. Not hello, not who is calling. The unit number, as if she were answering a phone at a business, and the business was the unit. I did not say anything for a second. Then I said, Is this Jay Reinecke? The voice said, Speaking. I said, This is Devin Alls. I'm the night clerk at Keypoint. The voice said, I know. I've been waiting for you to call. I'd like to schedule an access escort. Tonight, if you're willing. 211, as usual. The hairs on the back of my neck rose in the way they do when a kitchen flat top has been heated past the point you can feel, and your hand goes near it without touching it. I said, We don't provide escorts. That's in the binder. There was a pause on the line. The voice said, Oh, you've read the binder. Another pause. That's unusual. Most of you don't. Marco read the binder. You're the second. I said, What happened to Marco? The voice said, Marco came down to escort me. He stood outside the door and he turned the key. He didn't have to come in. He chose to come in. That's an important distinction, Devin. The lock doesn't open for anyone who doesn't choose. That's the entire point of the arrangement. The clerk is on duty to refuse. Marco refused for 9 months, and then on the 10th month he agreed. You'll do the same. They all do, eventually. The binder exists to slow it down. I said, Who are you? The voice said, I'm the tenant of record. Currently Jay Reinecke. Before that, Robert Quill. Before that, Esme Tassin. The lease is the same lease. We keep signing it forward so the building keeps it on the books. It's important that there be a name on the books, Devin. It's important that the unit be rented. Empty units get inspected. Empty units get cleared out for lien sale. We can't have that. I said, What's in the unit? The voice said, Nothing when it's empty. Something when somebody opens it. The 2 states are not unrelated. I hung up. I sat on the kitchen floor for a long time with my back against the dishwasher. My daughter's drawings were on the refrigerator above me. One of them was a picture of a house with too many windows, and a sun in the upper right corner that was almost the same size as the house. I looked at the sun for a while. I thought about Marco Vela's jacket on the hook by the office door. And I thought about the receiving log that had logged a package in my name that did not physically exist. And I thought about the voice on the phone saying the clerk is on duty to refuse. And I understood, sitting on the kitchen floor, that I had been hired into a position whose primary function was not to manage a storage facility, but to be the person who said no to a request that would be made on a schedule by something that was being held in place by the fact that the request kept being refused. I called Brenda. I asked her one more question. I asked her how long she had worked at Keypoint. She said 18 years. I asked her if she had ever been offered the night shift. She said she had been offered it twice, first in 2008 and then in 2018, and that she had refused both times because she had small kids at home in 2008 and a sick mother in 2018. I asked her if anybody had explained, when they offered her the shift, that the job had a binder. She said no, nobody had ever mentioned a binder. She had only learned about the protocol from Marco in the last week of his life, when he had started behaving strangely and had told her about it in pieces during shift changes. I asked her one last thing. I asked her if she knew which night clerks had worked the position before Marco. She said she would have to think about it. She named 4 people, going back to when she started. 2 of them, she had heard, had moved out of state. 1 of them had died of cancer a few years ago. 1 of them, she said, had been a man named Robert Quill, who had worked the night shift at Key Point for 9 months in 2013, and had then, according to the official record, quit without notice. Robert Quill was the name on the 2018 rental agreement for Unit 214. The tenants of record were the night clerks. I did not sleep that day. I sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, and I wrote down the 6 names from the rental agreements and the dates of each agreement, and I went back through everything Brenda had told me about previous night clerks, and I made phone calls. Not to the tenants. Not yet. I called the steakhouse, where I still knew the GM, a man named Pete Karras, and I asked Pete if he could run a name through the background check service the steakhouse used for new hires. Pete and I had been on the line together for 9 years, and he owed me a favor from a night I had covered for him when his wife was in the hospital. He said he could run 2 names without anybody noticing. I gave him Howard Lesep and Patricia Ng. I figured the older names were less likely to flag any current system. Pete called me back at 3 in the afternoon. He said both names came back with the same pattern. Both had Delaware driver's licenses that had been issued, renewed once, and then never renewed again. Both had Social Security numbers that showed wage earnings from Key Point self-storage for 9 to 11 months. And then nothing. Not a death certificate, not a forwarding tax filing, not a credit inquiry, not a vehicle registration past the year of their last paycheck. He said it was the kind of pattern you see when somebody enters witness protection, except that witness protection leaves a different kind of footprint. And this looked more like somebody had simply walked off the surface of the record-keeping economy. He said it was unusual, but not impossible. People disappear all the time, he said. They just usually don't disappear in clusters of 6 from the same employer. I asked him if he could run one more. I gave him Marco Vela. Pete went quiet for a second and then said he would call me back. He called me back 20 minutes later. He said Marco Vela had a Delaware driver's license issued in January of last year, that the address on the license was a P.O. box in Newark, and that the Social Security number on Marco's W-4 was associated, in the background check service, with a Marco Vela who had been declared deceased in a hospital in Trenton, New Jersey, in 2009. He said the SSN had been recycled, which is not supposed to happen but does, and that whoever the Marco who worked at Key Point actually was, he had not been the original holder of that number. Pete asked me what I was getting myself into. I told him I didn't know yet. He told me to be careful. I told him I would. I have been thinking about that conversation a lot since. What I understood from Pete's call was that the names in the rental agreements were not exactly the night clerks. The names were close to them, or borrowed from them, or built out of pieces of them, but the people they referred to were not findable. Howard Lesep, whoever he had been, had ceased to exist in any system the world keeps track of within a year of signing the lease for Unit 214. Patricia Ng had done the same. Marco Vela had been issued an identity that had originally belonged to a man who died 15 years ago in another state. The arrangement, whatever else it was, included a record-keeping layer. Somebody was generating documentation for these people on the front end, and somebody was allowing the documentation to dissolve on the back end. That kind of arrangement is not maintained by a single person. That kind of arrangement requires institutional cover at multiple points. The way a passport forgery operation requires not just a printer, but a network of people willing to look at the forged passport and stamp it. I went into work that night 90 minutes early. I parked across the street in the lot of a closed muffler shop, and I sat in my car and I watched the front gate of Key Point self-storage from 9:30 until 9:58. At 9:58, the gate arm lifted. No vehicle entered. The gate arm stayed up for the time it would take a car to pass through, and then it lowered. I watched it through binoculars I had bought that afternoon at a Walmart on my way in. There was nothing at the gate. No heat shimmer. No movement of leaves on the ground beneath the arm. Nothing. The gate cycled the way the gate cycles when a registered code is entered, and the gate logged J. Reineke's code at 9:58, and at 10:01, when I walked into the office to clock in, the buzzer for Unit 214 began ringing, on schedule, as if I had not seen the gate cycle for no one. I clocked in. I sat at the desk. The buzzer rang for the full 13 minutes it usually rings, and then it stopped. The office phone began ringing at 10:18. I let it ring. The phone rang 12 times and then went to voicemail. The voicemail beep came through the office speaker. There was no message recorded. The system logged a call received from the 302 number, duration 39 seconds, voicemail empty. At 10:30, I picked up the office phone and I called the regional manager. His name is Owen Petrick. I had never called him at night before. He picked up on the fourth ring and he sounded surprised to hear my voice. I asked him if he had a minute. He said he did. I told him, in the calmest voice I could manage, that I had read the binder in the office safe, that I had read the incident log, that I had read the line that said do not reference 214 in Marco Vela's personnel file, and that I wanted to know what the company's actual position was on the unit and on the tenant. Owen was quiet for a long time. I could hear a television in the background on his end, the muffled drone of a sports announcer. He turned it down. He said, "Devin, I'm going to ask you to listen to me carefully. The position of the company is that Unit 214 is a long-term private rental and that no employee is to interact with the tenant beyond standard billing. The protocol predates my involvement. I inherited it from my predecessor, who inherited it from hers. I do not know who originally established it. I do not want to know. The company tolerates the protocol because the rent is paid in full annually by certified check, because the unit generates no complaints, and because every time anyone has tried to interfere with the arrangement, that person has experienced an outcome the company has not been able to explain to insurance. I'm telling you this because you have already read enough that you are going to keep going if I don't, and I would rather you go forward with the actual information than with whatever you've been assembling on your own." He took a breath. He said, "Marco was the third clerk in 11 years to be lost to the unit on my watch. I do not know what happens inside it. I have never opened it. I have never wanted to. I do know that the tenant calls when she wants a clerk to come down and that the binder exists to remind the clerk to refuse the call. I have also known, since the night Marco didn't come back, that the protocol is failing. It worked for 30 years because nobody read the binder twice. You are reading it more than twice. That means the protocol is going to require a different kind of refusal from you than it required from your predecessors. I don't know what that refusal looks like. I'm telling you that because I think you deserve to know what kind of decision you're going to have to make. And I'm telling you that if you decide to walk away from the job tonight, right now, before anything else happens, the company will pay out your final 2 weeks, will write you a clean reference, and will mark your file with a code that ensures no facility under our corporate umbrella will ever hire you again, which is for your protection, not ours. Do you want me to start that paperwork?" I did not answer him for a long time. I sat in the chair, and I watched the monitor for Corridor C, which was empty, and I thought about my daughter. And I thought about Pete Karras on the phone telling me to be careful. And I thought about the brass disc lock with the M scratched into it that had been scratched by Marco Vela because Marco Vela had gone down the corridor on a night somebody asked him to. And I thought about the voice on the phone saying the clerk is on duty to refuse. I said, "Not yet, Owen. Give me 1 more week." He said, "Devin, please don't do anything heroic. The unit has been there for 30 years. It will still be there next week if you decide to walk. Heroism is the thing the protocol is designed to absorb. You understand what I'm telling you?" I said I understood. I hung up. I am not sure he believed me. I am not sure I believed me. I spent the rest of the shift doing what I should have done 2 weeks earlier, which was to read every entry in the binders slowly, in order with a yellow highlighter, and to make a separate list on my legal pad of the patterns. 3 patterns emerged. The first was that every documented attempted entry by an outside party pest control, fire marshal, insurance adjuster, had been deflected with paperwork and a small payment, never with confrontation. The system had a budget for compliance. The system knew how to absorb regulators. The second pattern was that every documented entry by an employee had been preceded by a phone call from the tenant on a Tuesday night between 11:30 and midnight. Marco's last entry recorded the call at 11:41. The calls on my own phone log had come in at 11:40 and 11:42. The tenant called on Tuesdays. The buzzer events had been Mondays and Wednesdays, which were rehearsals, not requests. The actual request came by phone, and it came on Tuesdays, and the next Tuesday was 4 days away. The third pattern was the one I had to read 3 times to be sure of. Every clerk who had been lost in a particular life circumstance. I had not noticed it on the first pass because the binder did not state it directly, but the entries included passing references to the clerk's personal situations, the way handover notes sometimes do. Howard Lessepp had been in the middle of a custody fight. Patricia Ung had been estranged from a brother in California. Dale Vorhauer had been about to file for bankruptcy. Esme Tassin had been newly widowed. Robert Quill had been waiting on the results of a biopsy. Marco Vela, according to the note clipped into his file, had not spoken to his sister in Baltimore for 2 years. Every clerk who had agreed to escort the tenant had been a person whose connections to other people were under strain at the moment of the request. The unit did not take strangers off the street. It took the people on the night shift, and the night shift was staffed by people who could be lost without anybody filing. I am the night clerk. I am 34 years old, divorced, with a 6-year-old daughter who lives with her mother and visits me on Thursdays and every other weekend. My mother is dead, and my father lives in Florida, and we speak twice a year. My closest friend is Pete Karras, and Pete Karras would notice if I disappeared, but would not, I think, push very hard against the conclusion of voluntary departure if the company told him I had quit. I am, in the framework the protocol uses to select, exactly the kind of person the unit selects. I had been hired into the shift not because I was qualified, which I am not, but because I matched the profile. Owen Petrick had looked at my application 4 months ago and had seen a man whose disappearance would create a soft impression in the world, and he had hired me on the spot. He had told me, over the phone, that the protocol was designed to absorb heroism. He had not told me that the protocol was also designed to select for people who could be heroically absorbed. At 4 in the morning, on a hunch, I got up and walked the entire building. Not just Corridor C, every corridor. I had never done that in a single pass before. The building has 4 corridors, A through D, arranged in a rough cross with the office at the center, and a total of 310 units. I walked them slowly, with a flashlight, and I looked at every door. What I was looking for was other brass disc locks. I found 3 more. 1 in Corridor A, Unit 47. 1 in Corridor B, Unit 156. 1 in Corridor D, Unit 288. All 3 were brass disc locks of the same vintage as the one on 214. All 3 were darkened with the same patina, and all 3 had a single letter scratched into the face of the disc with the point of a key. The letter on 47 was an L. The letter on 156 was a Q. The letter on 288 was a V. LQV Howard Lessepp, Robert Quill, Marco Vela. I stood in Corridor D in front of Unit 288 for a long time. The fluorescence hummed. The metal roof ticked. Somewhere on the property, a vent fan cycled on and cycled off. I thought about the fact that the building had 310 units, and that 4 of them were on a protocol, and that the protocol was tracking not one tenant, but a small archive of clerks whose initials had been scratched into the brass of their own personal doors, and that the unit numbers 47 and 156 and 288 were not random. They were the units the clerks had become, and that the building was therefore not a storage facility with one anomalous tenant. The building was a structure with multiple long-term residents who had originally been employees, and 214 was simply the most recent active example. the one currently being maintained by the woman on the phone. And there would be more. There were going to be more, and I was going to be one of them unless I did something that nobody had done in 30 years, which was to refuse the request in a way the protocol could not absorb. I walked back to the office. I sat at the desk. I opened the binder to a blank page at the back, and I wrote the date and my initials, DA, and I wrote a single line. 3 additional units identified by lock signature. 47-L, 156-Q, 288-V. Protocol is older than recorded. Protocol is structural. I put the binder back in the safe. I closed the safe. I clocked out at 6. I did not say anything to Brenda when she came in. She looked at my face and she did not ask. The next Tuesday was 4 days away. The phone would ring at 11:40. I had 4 days to decide what kind of refusal I was going to use. I spent the next 4 days doing things that, on paper, will look insane, and I want to walk through them in order so that what I did on Tuesday night will be understood as something I built toward, rather than something I lost my mind and did. On Friday morning, I drove to the New Castle County Recorder of Deeds, and I pulled the title history on the parcel at the address of Key Point Self-Storage. The parcel had been agricultural until 1993, when it had been sold by a family named Halsey to a Delaware LLC called Inland Yard Holdings, which had built the storage facility in 1994. Inland Yard Holdings had been dissolved in 2011 when the property was sold to the current corporate owner. The 1993 sale deed had a rider attached to it. The rider was unusual. It said that the seller, the Halsey family, retained a personal use easement over a portion of the parcel for the lifetime of the youngest surviving signatory and any successor designated in writing. The legal description of the easement was vague. It referred to a structure to be erected on the southwest quadrant of the parcel, dimensions to be determined by the purchaser, with sole occupancy rights reserved to the Halsey designee in perpetuity. The southwest quadrant of the parcel is where Corridor C sits. Unit 214 is the 3rd unit from the south end of Corridor C. The easement, as far as I could tell from the language, was a private right held by the Halsey family to occupy a single unit of the building that had not yet been built when the easement was drafted, for as long as the youngest signatory, or her designee, remained alive. That was the first thing. The unit was not really a rental. The unit was a private right embedded in the land itself, predating the building, and the rental agreements were a cover document the building's owners used to keep the property tax assessor and the corporate auditors satisfied. The protocol existed because the building's owners had inherited a legal obligation along with the parcel, and the obligation was older than any of them, and none of them had wanted to be the owner who tested what would happen if they violated it. On Saturday, I drove to a small town in Sussex County called Frankford, where the property tax records had given me a current mailing address for the trust that received the easement's annual nominal payment of $1. The address was a brick rancher on a quiet street. I parked across the road and I sat in my car for an hour before I worked up the courage to knock. The woman who answered the door was in her 70s, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, and she looked at me through the storm door for a long moment before she opened it. I said my name. I said where I worked. She said, "I wondered when one of you would come down here. The last one came in 2013. Sit down. I'll make coffee." Her name was Margaret Halsey, the same Margaret Halsey who had been regional manager until 2019, the same surname as the M. Halsey who had signed the protocol in 1994, the same family that had sold the parcel in 1993. She was the youngest of the 3 signatories on the original deed. Her sister had died in 2007. Her brother had died in 2016. She was the only living signatory, which meant that the easement, as written, would expire when she did, unless she had designated a successor in writing, which I asked her about directly. And she shook her head, and she said, "I have not. I will not. The point of me coming back here to Frankfurt in 2019 was to stop designating successors. The point of me retiring was to let the easement die with me." I asked her what was in the unit. She poured me coffee and she sat across from me at her kitchen table and she said, "I don't know exactly, My grandfather knew. He's the one who negotiated the easement when he sold the land. He told my father told my sister told my brother told me. Each of us got a slightly different version. What I can tell you is that the family had been farming that parcel since 1881, and that there was a structure on the southwest corner that predated us, a kind of root cellar built into a slight rise in the field, and that the structure had been there when my great-grandfather bought the land, and that we never used it for storage because the men in my family didn't like to go near it. My grandfather, when he sold the parcel in 1993, made the buyer agree to build the new building over the old cellar, and to leave the cellar intact beneath one of the rental units, and to allow the family to keep someone listed as the tenant of that unit forever. The buyer agreed because the price came down $120,000 in exchange. My grandfather thought he was solving the problem by sealing the old cellar inside a building and putting a paying customer on the books in front of it. He thought the paperwork would keep it quiet. He was wrong about the second part. I asked her what was in the cellar. She held her coffee in both hands. She said, "My grandfather told me, the year before he died, that the cellar held what he called a guest. He said the family had been feeding the guest small things, not food, but attentions, since 1881. He said the guest did not eat people. He said the guest collected them. He said the difference was important. He said that as long as somebody was listed as the tenant, and as long as the tenant was a person who had agreed to be the tenant in a way the guest recognized as an agreement, the guest stayed quiet because the guest understood, in whatever way it understood things, that the unit was occupied and therefore that there was no vacancy. He said the worst thing that could happen was for the unit to be empty and to read as available." I asked her about the night clerks. She closed her eyes. She said, "That started after I retired. The protocol my grandfather wrote in 1994 said the tenant of record should be a member of the family, rotating every 5 years, with the lease signed under whatever false name was convenient. We did it ourselves for 20 years. I signed 3 of those leases. So did my brother. So did my sister. After my brother died, I was the only one left, and I was getting old, and I made a mistake. In 2018, instead of signing the new lease under another false name of my own, I let the night clerk sign it. His name was Robert Quill. He didn't know what he was signing. He thought he was correcting a paperwork error. I let him sign it because I was tired, and because I wanted to start letting the easement die, and I thought that putting an employee's name on the lease would weaken the chain, would make it easier for the corporate owners to question the arrangement after I was gone. I was wrong. The guest recognized the signature. The guest accepted Robert Quill as the new tenant of record. And then the guest, which had been quiet for 90 years under our family's stewardship, did what guests do when their host changes without notice. It tested the new arrangement. It called the office. It asked for an escort. Robert Quill went down the corridor and he did not come back. The lease rolled over. The tenant of record became on paper Esme Tassin, which is a name the guest selected, and that name then signed the next lease, and so on. The clerks have been signing the leases for each other for 6 years now, in handwriting none of them recognize, and the guest has been operating the chain by itself, without me, since 2019. I have not been involved. I am not the maintainer anymore. The maintainer is the protocol, and the protocol now lives inside the building's own paperwork. I asked her why she had not told anybody. She said, "Who would I tell? The company that owns the building? They know. They've known since 2011. Owen Petrick knows. Owen's predecessor knew. The county? The county would inspect the unit, and the unit would be empty. And they would clear the parcel, and then there would be a vacancy. And a vacancy is the one thing the guest will not tolerate." I retired to stop signing the leases. I thought that without me, the chain would break. Instead, the chain learned how to sign itself. That is the actual horror of this story, Devin, and I want you to hear it clearly. The arrangement my family made in 1881 was supposed to be a private burden carried by people who chose it. It is now a public process that selects strangers. I did that. I made that happen by walking away without breaking the chain first. I have been sitting in this house for 5 years knowing that. and I have not known what to do about it because the only thing I can think to do is to drive up there and sign the lease again under my own name and resume the burden. And I am 73 years old, and I do not have the strength to be the tenant of record for another 20 years, and I will not designate a successor, and so the chain will keep selecting clerks until somebody breaks it from the inside. I sat with that for a while. Then I asked her the question I had driven to Frankfurt to ask. I asked her what would happen if I refused the call on Tuesday night. Not refused by not going down the corridor. Refused by terminating the lease. By marking the unit empty. By breaking the paperwork that was holding the chain together. She looked at me across her kitchen table. She said, "The unit would read as vacant. The guest would test the vacancy. I don't know what that test would look like because in 143 years nobody in my family has ever let the unit go vacant. The protocol exists specifically to prevent that test. But I will tell you what I think. I think the guest has been collecting clerks because the clerks were available and the family was not. I think if you remove the unit from the building's rental system, if you do it in a way the paperwork accepts, the guest loses its handle on the building. I think the building becomes a building again, and the cellar becomes a cellar, and the guest goes back to being whatever it was in 1881. Before my great-grandfather started feeding it attentions. I think that's what I would do if I were 30 years younger, and if I had the standing inside the building to make the paperwork accept the change. You have that standing. You're the night clerk. You can mark the unit as abandoned. The system will accept your initials on that form because the system has already accepted your initials on a receiving log for a package that did not exist. The system thinks you're already part of the chain. You can use that if you're willing to. I drove back to Newcastle County on Saturday night, and I did not sleep on Sunday, and I did not sleep on Monday. On Tuesday morning, I called Owen Petrick. I told him what I was going to do. I told him I was going to mark Unit 214 as abandoned in the system at 11:40 p.m., 3 minutes before the tenant's weekly call, and that I needed him to know in advance because what came next was going to require him to back the paperwork up with the corporate office in the morning, regardless of what happened in the building tonight. Owen was quiet for a long time. He said, "Devin, that's not refusal. That's confrontation." I said, "I know." He said, "The protocol doesn't survive confrontation." I said, "That's the point." He said, "If you do this and you live through it, the company will fire you. I want you to understand that. The arrangement is older than the company, but the paperwork is the company's. And the company will not employ a clerk who broke its paperwork." I said I understood. He said, "If you do this and you don't live through it, I'll tell your daughter you were a careful man who tried to fix something nobody else would." I told him that was the kindest thing he had ever said to me. He said it was the only kind thing he had to offer. He said good luck and he hung up. I worked my shift normally until 11:30. I logged the front gate. I logged a tenant who came in at 10:20 to retrieve a guitar case from a unit in Corridor B. I made coffee. I sat at the desk. At 11:38, I opened the lease management screen in the company's tenant system. I navigated to Unit 214. I selected the field that read Tenant Status Active. I changed it to Abandoned No Forwarding. I typed in the notes field. Unit confirmed vacated. No personal property remaining. Lease terminated under Abandonment Clause, Section 14 BD Alls, Night Clerk, on duty. I selected Save. The system asked me to confirm. I confirmed. The screen refreshed. The tenant field for Unit 214 went blank. The lease history disappeared. The paper file in the cabinet, which I had set on the corner of the desk in advance, did not disappear. It sat there exactly as it had been. 6 rental agreements in chronological order, an artifact of a chain the system no longer acknowledged. At 11:40, the office phone rang. I did not pick it up. The phone rang for a long time. It rang for a longer time than the office phone should be able to ring before going to voicemail. It rang for, by my count, 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and the system did not record the call because the tenant of record no longer existed, and the phone system did not know who was calling. The ringing eventually stopped. I sat at the desk, and I waited. The buzzer for Unit 214 did not go off. There was no buzzer for an abandoned unit. The system did not have a category for what was being asked. At 11:53, the gate cycled. No vehicle entered. The cameras this time did not just show an empty driveway. The cameras showed the gate arm lifting and the gate arm lowering, but the gravel of the drive showed the impressions of footsteps. Slow ones, walking from the gate toward the office, made by something whose weight pressed the gravel down in a roughly human pattern, but whose feet, as far as I could tell from the monitor, did not exist. I watched the impressions cross the front lot and stop 10 feet from the office door. They stood there for 40 seconds. Then they walked back to the gate, and the gate cycled again. And the impressions were gone, and the gravel, on the next pan of the camera, was undisturbed in the way gravel is undisturbed when nothing has crossed it. I sat at the desk for the rest of the shift. The building made the noises buildings make. The fluorescents hummed. The metal roof ticked. The vent fans cycled. I did not walk down corridor C. I did not need to. I knew, the way you know in a kitchen when a fire has burned itself out under a vent hood without you having to look, that the unit was now what the paperwork said it was, which was empty. At 5:58, Brenda came in, and she looked at my face, and she said, "You did it, didn't you?" I said yes. She said, "Owen called me. He told me what you were going to do. I'm sorry I didn't help." I told her she had helped, because she was the one who had told me Marco had gone down the corridor, and without that, I would have refused in the wrong way, the way the protocol had been built to absorb. She poured me coffee. We did not speak again until I left. I drove home that morning along Route 13 in the gray light before sunrise, and I thought about Margaret Halsey in her kitchen in Frankfurt, and about Marco Vela's jacket, which I had taken from the hook on my way out and folded into my passenger seat to drop at his sister's address in Baltimore later that week. And I thought about how the company would fire me in the morning, and how I would have to find another job, and how I would explain to my daughter that I had quit a job that was good for our schedule because of a thing I could not really tell her about. I thought about the 4 brass disc locks still on the 4 doors. I had marked 1 unit abandoned. There were 3 others. The clerks who had become those units were not coming back. The unit numbers 47 and 156 and 288 were still on the company's books as long-term private rentals with the same kind of paperwork that 214 had carried. And somewhere in the safe, presumably, there was a binder protocol for each of them that no clerk had read in years. I had broken 1 chain. I had not broken the building. Owen called me at 9 the next morning. He told me I was terminated effective immediately, that the final 2 weeks would be paid out, that the reference would be clean, and that the company was sealing the binder and the paper file for 214 in a corporate archive in Wilmington, where, he said, it can stop being our problem and start being a problem for whoever inherits the corporate archive in 20 years. I asked him about units 47 and 156 and 288. He was quiet. He said, "Devin, you did one. You did what you could do as one man. Don't ask me to thank you by asking me to do the other 3. I don't have the standing. I have a wife, and I have a mortgage, and I have a son in college, and I am not the person who fixes this. I am the person who hands it forward. I am sorry, that's the truth. I am telling it to you because you've earned that much. I am telling you all of this now, 6 weeks later, from a new job at a tire and auto shop in Bear, Delaware, where I make slightly more money than I made at Keypoint, and where I do not have to sit alone in an office at night. My daughter is at her mother's tonight. I have Unit 214's paper file in a banker's box in my closet, which I removed from the office on my last shift, and which Owen, when he saw me carry it out, pretended not to see. The file is closed. The chain on that unit is broken. The guest is, as far as I know, sealed back into a root cellar built in 1881 with no tenant of record above it and no signature for it to recognize. The reason I'm telling this story now is that last Tuesday, a little after 11:40 p.m., my home phone rang. I do not have a home phone. I have only a cell phone. The ringing was coming from the wall jack in my kitchen, where the previous tenant of this apartment had left an old corded handset plugged in, which I had not removed because it was not in the way of anything. The cord was not connected to a phone line. The apartment building does not maintain copper service to its units. The phone rang for 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I did not pick it up. I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the dishwasher, the way I had sat the morning after my first call with Jay Reinecke, and I watched the phone and I counted the rings. It will ring again next Tuesday. I think it will ring every Tuesday at 11:40 for as long as it takes me to do one of two things. The first thing is to pick up the phone, which I will not do because I know who is calling, and I know what she is calling to ask, and I know that the only reason the chain at Key Point has not reformed is that nobody has agreed to be the new tenant of record. The second thing is to go back to the building in the daylight with a small toolkit and to cut the brass disc locks off units 47 and 156 and 288, and to mark those units abandoned in a system I no longer have a login for, and to break the other 3 chains before they find new clerks to absorb. I have been thinking about which of those 2 things I am going to do. I will tell you honestly that I have not decided yet. I will tell you that I have caught myself twice this week looking at the kitchen phone with something that is not quite curiosity and not quite obligation, but is closer to the feeling I used to get on the line at the steakhouse when an order would come in for a dish I had not made in years. The feeling of being asked by a system to remember a procedure I had once known. I will tell you that the night clerk at Key Point Self-Storage right now is a young man named Tyler, whom I have never met, who was hired 3 weeks after my termination, and whose name I have seen on the public business filings because the corporate owner is required to list the licensee for the alarm system. Tyler does not know about the binder. The binder is in Wilmington in a sealed archive. Tyler will, in 9 months or so, be invited by the chain at Unit 47 or Unit 156 or Unit 288 to come down the corridor and turn a key. Whether he goes is a question I cannot answer for him. What I can tell you is this: the unit number was 214. I held on to that number the way I told you to. Everything else in the building moved, and a lot of it is still moving. But Unit 214 is empty now, and the brass disc lock on it has been cut off and thrown into the Delaware River off the I-295 bridge, and the cellar beneath it, whatever is in it, has no tenant. That is the one thing I did. That is the only thing I am sure of. The phone in my kitchen is ringing again right now as I am writing this last paragraph. It is 11:41 on a Tuesday. I am not going to pick it up. I am going to finish this sentence, and I am going to get up, and I am going to walk into the bedroom, and I am going to close the door, and I am going to wait for the ringing to stop, the way I have learned to wait, the way I am going to keep learning to wait. For as long as it takes the thing on the other end of the line to understand that the clerk on duty is, finally, refusing.